TPR. Let's just dive right into it. It's been a real busy few months for you. Like पिछले क्या 6 महीने साल.
December, हाँ 6 महीने हो गए. December, I think we launched the book in December.
Yeah.
Yeah, so December we launched the book, and then I think last month we launched the podcast. So it's
Yeah.
been
It's
about 6
been
months.
because for people who are coming into this episode cold, हमने आपसे बात की थी like I think साल पहले 1.5 साल पहले something, because we do Jinn Story
No, I
episodes
think it was before that. I think it was almost 2 years.
almost two
मतलब
years ago.
when I started writing those tweets,
हाँ
it was then very initial days when it
हाँ
went viral and stuff that we spoke.
हाँ
So it's been almost 2 years. It was like middle of COVID actually.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because we used to do, people would have people like Jinn stories, basically horror
Mm.
stories. लोगों को पसंद है. So we would find these on the internet, and then we found randomly as your tweets were exploding all over the internet. हमने कहा कि अच्छा भी इनको भी जतिन भाई को भी बुला लेते हैं. We had no idea. Maybe you mentioned it उस वक्त कि there might be something in the works back early stages. But
Mm.
for background, what I knew was that Jatin is a person who is from Delhi, strong Delhi representation, lives in the US, and loves these old folk stories, horror stories. जिसमें जिन भूत का जिक्र है, सब कुछ है, but there's a lot of Delhi. So, what is that journey? How did you go from great tweets, very popular tweets about this horror story, and now to a book and then a podcast?
So once so this was like, this was, I think, May of 2020. Yeah, May of
Hmm.
2020, right? When the lockdown had just, I
Uh-huh.
think April is when lockdown started. March is when lockdown started in most of the countries. April was when it started in US. And so I have a traveling job, so I have to travel a lot, right?
Right.
So when COVID happened, मेरी travel वगैरह सब रुक गई. So you have like 3-4 hours now, when you figure out that you have it free. Or COVID का time था, so everybody was connected to Twitter. It was the usage wasn't on time. That was the only way you were communicating or talking or killing time, right?
Yeah.
So ऐसे ही बैठे बैठे I was going through my old diary. So 20 years back when I used to like walk around Delhi, I used to just talk to people, collect stories, all kind of stories, like not just ghost stories or paranormal stories, but just all kind of stories, food, culture, history of a
Mm-hmm.
monument, the general, life of people in Delhi. So, I was just going through my old diaries, and then I figured out there was like whole bunch of these ghost stories that were based in Delhi. So I thought चलो रात को it was 11-12 बजे का time था. I was like चलो और कुछ करने को नहीं है, let's just tweet a story and it'll be a good time pass for folks. एक story डाली, I went to sleep.
Yeah.
सुबह आके देखा तो like it had blown. Right? Yeah, two stories I put. Right? Two
Yeah.
stories I put. I think, and one of those stories was actually pretty. It was one of those stories that sort of everybody knows. What I did was I just twisted it a little bit. Because I just twisted the end of the story a little bit and
Yeah.
give it a different
Yeah.
story. I didn't figure out. सुबह उठा तो the bloody this thing had blown up. There were like 10,000, 20,000 reactions to it, likes to it. So then, and obviously there was a lot of stuff people were asking for more stories. So then I started tweeting every day, one story, one story, one story. And then suddenly it was like, I think collection of, I think first time I tweeted about 10, 12 stories, and every it just blew up. It absolutely blew up. Like people from, not just from Delhi, but India and all over the world kind of
Mm-hmm.
started following that. So that's from there it all started, right? And I think that the difference between those stories and other general ghost stories were these stories were set in midst of people. So the reader was actually in the middle of the story. So I deliberately set these stories up in the areas where either you pass by every day or you would have passed by, at least if you live in Delhi, it's a place where you very commonly go, or if you're a tourist, you're bound to be somewhere in that place, right? You would have like read to that, even if you're in. I mean, you've never been in Delhi, but you still have known that there's a market called Sarojini Nagar Market, which is like a flea market kind of a thing. तो
Yeah.
जो भी बाहर से भी आया हुआ है वो भी वो वहाँ कहीं आसपास ना कहीं गया होगा. Either
Huh.
it's a nice monument or a eatery or some significance in pop culture and stuff like that. So you said the story in the midst. So reader is not part of the story. The reader is in the middle of the story.
Hmm.
And I absolutely didn't want to make it cliched,
Right.
which is like, it's not like, typical Jinn story or typical Chural story or stuff like that, right? I didn't want to make it cliche.
Huh.
Because that would have been like insult to my intelligence. Because ek to, a 40-year-old man who's a
Yeah.
management consultant by profession,
Yeah.
tweeting ghost stories any
Huh.
which ways, is not a very common,
Huh.
relatively senior corporate executive
Huh.
tweeting a ghost story any which ways is to
Yeah.
me it was like, "Yeah, what am I doing?"
Huh.
And then making it cliche would have been just killed it. So I
Right.
just want to make sure that at least it's an intelligent story which people can relate to and resonate.
Hmm.
So that was the whole intent. So then it obviously blew up, and that's how you found me, and that's how a couple of other people found me. Uh, Interestingly, book happened much later. The first people who actually started noticing these were folks from Bollywood.
Acha.
So I had a lot of people from, and these are like top tier people, not just like wannabes or like top tier folks who started approaching me. Ki, let's do a movie or let's do a series
अच्छा,
and stuff like that. So
मतलब शुरू से ही.
yeah, पहले वो था, but interesting. And me being an outsider, obviously also very excited. कि, ये तो मतलब 4 दिन में like, Bollywood has picked it up. So अब तो
Yeah.
कुछ ना कुछ बड़ा
हाँ.
बनेगा इसका.
हाँ.
And so that also kept me motivated. So that's why I kept
Right.
giving this story. I was like, this is definitely not going to be a one-time game. One is obviously interest because the more you write, the better you become. There's no other way of making good stories other than
Right.
keep
Right.
writing it. Some so like if you uh, just if you're writing something, if you're telling these stories around, there will be like 80% of these stories would be, or 70% of the stories will be average, right? It will be 10% will be really really good,
Hmm.
and 20% will be absolute crap, right? So you
Hmm.
need to keep writing and keep honing your skills. So one was that. Second was like I was like, this is obviously it's working. People are noticing. तो कुछ बड़ा बनेगा इसका. And so I got very excited कि भैया तो मतलब हफ्ते भर में Bollywood and all.
हाँ.
But Bollywood being Bollywood, they'll come, they'll have a lot of discussions, and then they'll just vanish. And that's been my experience with these, with the Bollywood in general. A
Hmm.
lot of discussions, a lot of this thing, but at the end of the day, some other projects will come up, some other priority will come up, and these guys will just vanish. So that didn't really happen. Then after that, a couple of publishing houses picked it up, and then from where Harper picked it up. I was very simple process. I said like and it was just I never thought I'll write a book in my lifetime. I mean
Right.
I never thought I'll do that. Even though
Huh.
my wife is a writer and editor, but I knew like I'm like grammatically challenged, so I'm pretty sure that I would have never written a book.
Right.
One of my friends actually suggested that you should write a book very early in the day. I was like, no, I don't think so. I can write a book.
Hmm.
I don't think this is like there's a hell lot of difference between a tweet,
Yes.
a
Exactly.
100-word
हाँ.
tweet and writing a story out of it, right?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
think I would have done that. Probably I would have been very even lazy. So some people find it easier to write long stories. I just find it easier to write tweets
Of course.
because one, you can create a lot of punch in a very small format. Right? Things move very fast.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and my stories, if you read all my stories, have one thing in common. It's not about they're haunted or not haunted or paranormal or not paranormal. It's the punch in the end, the twist in the end, which is
Right. Right.
unexpected, which I
Right.
like writing. Which I write horror like a thriller.
हाँ.
It's not like so. I think that's where I find um, my writing different from a lot of other writers.
Hmm.
Also different from a lot of. So I've been following Pakistani Jinn stories for a while now, right? I pretty much on all the popular I think writers on Insta, and I won't take the names, but we have got one or two very popular
Hmm.
Pakistani writers, and Jinn stories are very popular. The difference there is again, their stories is like what the jinn does and to who he does it and how it does it, right?
Yeah.
But there is not a that end to it, right? So
Yeah.
there is not like it's not like a thriller. It's like a
Hmm.
proper it starts spooking you out and keeps spooking you out, spooking
Right,
you out,
right,
and
right.
it
There's build up
ends,
nahi hai.
right? It's build up, right?
Yeah,
It keeps
yeah.
speaking you, and there's not a twist. And what I wanted to do was write a horror like a thriller.
Mm.
In the first story itself, I realized that why these are doing well is because the reader is reading. It's going in one direction, and then suddenly it takes a turn,
Right,
and
right.
that's where they started doing well, right? So that's how I always wanted to write these stories.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's where the Twitter was very impactful,
Mm.
because I didn't have to waste, not to use the word waste, but I would just write it my way, very fast paced, very fast moving.
ठीक है.
I was not sure whether in a short story I would be able to, in a 5,000 word, 10,000 word story, I would be able to create that impact.
Right, right, right.
But the publisher said, we like the stories, here's the contract, and let's create. So they didn't even want me to. They said,
When
give me
is
a
this
sample.
happening,
I
Andazan?
so I think this happened in October, October, November timeframe. Oh
2020.
yeah, so 2020. Yeah, 2020,
So like in
October
like 4 or 5
2020.
months of the
Four or
tweets
five
first
months,
going
I
out.
think. Yes, so 5 was marathon.
Right.
Then it took me almost 8 months to write a book, and then obviously 6 7 months for the publisher to
सही,
edit
सही.
and put
हाँ.
put the back. So so it happened. So from that, the book happened. Obviously, I had to ask my wife, because I was like, if I
And
write a
your wife, I'm
book.
assuming, is the other
Yeah,
person
she's a
who
co-author.
mentioned on the
Yeah, yeah,
thing. हाँ.
she's the co-author, right? I was
Yeah,
like,
just so that people can see we have the book here. देखिए
yeah.
पहले आप देख लें इधर. Yeah.
So Parna Chawla, she's my wife.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was like, this is, and she's a writer and editor. I was like, this is what has come up with. What do you think? She's like, yeah, let's just do it. She's like, I can write. I can't
Mm.
create a plot. I was like,
Mm.
I can create a plot. I cannot write. So it's like a
हाँ.
perfect this thing.
Yeah,
She
yeah,
was, she
yeah.
was very clear. She was like, I'm a writer. I'm an editor. I can create a plot. If you can create a plot, I'll create a story out of it. I was like, yeah, plots I have. There's plenty of plots that we have.
Yeah.
So then I think that's how we sort of started writing, and then we figured out that in order to create these tweets into stories, there are two elements that we need to do, right? Which actually came very naturally to me, which is one is essentially um, two things. One came very naturally to me, which is essentially every story has to have something about Delhi.
Mm.
So you are, you are. It's an intersection between something happening and then telling you something about Delhi. So that, obviously fills in the story, right? So it keeps the story moving. It's either about food of Delhi or culture of Delhi or,
Yeah.
monument of Delhi or
Yeah.
something of that sort. So there are two things parallelly happening. You're reading something about Delhi and then something about you. The second thing was the character arcs, how the character develops. That comes very naturally to my wife. So
अच्छा.
every there's a character, how the character develops and stuff like that.
Mm.
So that's how we sort of I wrote it, while I focused on the plot and on the place where the story is being situated. My wife focused on the actual writing and creating those character arcs.
अच्छा. So what sort of, because tweets, they can, like you were saying, it's easy to make impact. So that's really a great वो जो होता है ना, like a product market fit, where you have a short
Right,
story and Twitter is a short medium. So udhar to it works. What
right.
how much detail are you able to give to your wife to flesh out further? What was that experience like for you?
See, fun was obviously what I developed was sort of small, um, like scenes. So
Hmm.
I am a by default, because I'm a management consultant.
Hmm.
I do stuff like design thinking and things like that. I'm a visualizer. I
Right.
visualize better than I sort of write.
Right.
So while everybody says you shouldn't really write a book with
Huh.
a movie in mind, I
Ah.
write with as if it's something is
Because I
playing
felt
in
that.
my in
Ah.
yeah, because that's how I write. I write like as if something is playing in front of me, is better than I write.
Right. Right.
So I created these small scenes, which had a play, something about the character, what he or she is thinking, how their background,
Hmm.
or their growing up years or their experiences are shaping up through the story.
Right. Right. Right.
And then something about Delhi, which was,
Right.
which is every scene, like I say, had something about Delhi. So that's how I sort of fleshed it out.
Uh-huh.
And then I gave it to her, and then she took it further and created a narrative out of each scene,
Right.
and build it up. And it also required a lot of research because, again, if I, like I said, a tweet into a story would have been very dry. It
Huh.
wouldn't have worked, right? So, so I like one of the stories which is there in the book is called Saturday Night, right?
Hmm.
So I had the concept in my mind that, that so thugs, for example, Saturday Night is actually all about thugs, right? So I've been very fascinated with the entire thugs movement or the thugs infestation in India and in
Hmm.
Delhi in particular. In Delhi in particular. So I've done a lot of research. I've read a lot about them. So I always knew that I have to, if I write some, there'll be one story where it'll be centered around thugs. That was Saturday Night. And when I started bit research about the story, then I figured out that in 2019, or I just general when I started doing some of the research about unusual things that have been discovered or happening in Delhi. Even I didn't know this, but in 2019, there's a very famous medical college
Hmm.
and a hospital in Delhi called Maulana
Right.
Abdul
Right.
Kalam Medical College
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
(MAMC). So sometimes in 2019 or 18, there's a construction happening in that hospital, and the workers found an 18th century sort of walls below the mortuary of the
Hmm.
hospital. And when the
Hmm.
archaeologists went there, they figured it out. This was actually an 18th or 19th century British jail where
Right.
quite a few prominent freedom fighters were actually hanged. And before it was converted into a jail, it was a sarai.
Hmm.
It was a sarai, and this was an area, which goes down to the old Delhi. It's that area, Delhi Gate. It's near Delhi Gate. So so it was like um, you know, that was very fascinating for me, right? So in the
Sure.
middle of a hospital, under a mortuary,
Yeah.
you find an 18th century sarai, which has links to Britishers and so
Yeah. Yeah.
18th sarai. Now, so two words clicked to me. One was sarai, one was 18th century.
Hmm.
And then I connected the dots. I sort of it was just said that, in 18th century, there's another thing that happened, which was the
Hmm.
rise of thugs in Delhi. And thugs' main target was the people who used to stay in these sarais. The traders who were passing by, they had a lot of money, and so the thugs used to attach themselves to these traders and staying in
Yeah.
the sarai,
Yeah.
and then kill them. Right. So
Yeah.
that's the reason. So that's the fact. So a lot of people ask me, is this all our stories true or false? And
Yeah.
like there's like so that's a fact that
Yeah.
happened. So
Yeah.
that thugs happened. That sarai happened. I connected thugs and sarai together, and then created a fiction around it. So there was a lot of you in that story if you read about, and that's my favorite story because actually it's based
Hmm.
on a lot of research, which is like and oral anecdotes, right? So which is, for
Right.
example, the thugs. There's a very famous, one of the most famous temples in Delhi called
Right.
Kalka
Right.
Mandir.
Right.
Now, according to oral anecdotes, the thugs, every time they
They'd
kill
kill someone.
somebody,
Yeah.
and they kill people with a rumal. They
Yeah.
tied. They
Yeah.
were forbidden to shed blood.
Yeah.
So they always kill some people by tying the rumal in this thing. And so after every time they kill somebody to atone the sin, or atone the sin or whatever reasons I didn't couldn't find the actual reason for it. They used to tie this rumal in that temple.
Yeah.
So there's a link to that. Then, interestingly, the initiation ceremony,
Hmm.
when
Yes.
you
Yes.
people were initiated into Thagri,
Yeah.
happened in a mosque which still
Hmm.
exists
Yeah.
in West Delhi
Yeah.
on the day of Dishera.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a lot of these kind of, I find these kind of anecdotes generally very, very interesting. So I have a story and I know all these things about Delhi.
Right.
So it
Right.
was now is a matter of just, you know, putting these stories together, some of the facts, some of the oral anecdote along with the fiction related together.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of research I did. And then obviously my wife then, created a whole
Huh.
narrative around it.
And to connect all these parts, you just add like there's been a murder, there's police
Yeah.
wale,
Oh,
they're trying to figure it out.
correct. Figure
And
it
there's
out.
somebody
Correct.
who
Correct.
knows Delhi ki old stories,
Correct.
and he knows the
Correct.
history of usse baat ki, usse baat
Yes.
ki.
Yes. Usse baat ki. Correct.
Yeah, yeah. And it really felt like because when I'm more than halfway through the book, but every one of the stories, there's that show, might be on Netflix, Luther के नाम से, उसमें वो है
Mm,
Idris Elba. So that's based in
correct.
London. He's a detective, whatever. And what I remember reading like a review about the show, and it says that there's another character in the show, and that character is London. So in your
Yeah,
stories,
absolutely.
yeah, Delhi is like a cat. There's so much
Yeah,
detail
yeah, yeah,
about
yeah.
is गली में क्या था, क्या खाना था. I remember reading someone saying कि हाँ जी जब mutton prepare होता है तो you can't have a grease वाली roti, you have either sheer mal or
Yeah,
something.
so that's those are kind of anecdotes I've thrown in and everything, just because
Mhm.
that's what we hear growing up in
Yeah,
Delhi, right? So
yeah,
every city has its certain quirks about food, right?
yeah, yeah.
So Delhi mein, like our grandfathers and our grandparents and people from old times, they always say कि mutton ke saath you always have something like, either a chapati without oil or something like a sheermal,
Yeah,
but not something like a paratha, which is
yeah.
heavy, because both mutton and paratha gets very heavy, right?
Ha,
So
ha,
something like,
ha.
so those are quirks that you have to listen to. You've heard it, so I've just
Mhm.
tried to incorporate.
Yeah,
This is
it adds nothing to the plot, but environment create होता है मजीद. It just gets deeper and deeper,
correct.
right? Huh. Um, and in my mind, like when you were mentioning you were thinking about it like a movie, in my mind there's it's a Netflix spin-off. There's this other series called Love, Death and Robots, which is
Hmm,
they've just given like 9 or 10 different tales to different animation studios, and everyone just makes a different thing. So in my mind these were stories started because I guess I've seen that. So all these stories like Delhi ka mujhe lag raha tha कि like एक map है, and on a map of Delhi these things are just happening, right? They're all happening in this one place. The stories might not even know about each other. Magar, it started to build really that sort of environment in my mind because of all the non-plot details that you were putting in. कि खाने की जगह चाय वाला पुलिस
correct.
वाले को recognize कर रहा है. इधर मस्जिद है that's connected to a temple, and दिल्ली की history आ रही है of going back centuries, and मुगल्स भी थे और thugs भी थे और सब कुछ था. So that's really like I haven't read many things like this. So,
Yeah.
how much when you're I keep going back to that thing of you mentioned कि बचपन में you were roaming around Delhi and collecting all these stories. So it almost seems like that character of Jatin walking around collecting the stories has also been translated into this. कि this is something that Delhi people do. They talk about these stories about Delhi. Is that a common thing that
Now,
happens?
see, I don't know. It happens. See, one is, of course, Delhi is, everybody is uh, very interesting in telling the story. So
Yeah,
essentially, if you stand next to a pond, but I guess that's not just true for Delhi. I think it's true for any
sure.
city, for
Huh.
that matter, right?
Huh.
Especially in subcontinent.
Huh.
Of
Huh.
course, not in
Huh.
America or anywhere else, but especially in subcontinent, I think it's true everywhere, right? मतलब जहाँ पर चार बंदे खड़े हो जाएंगे, they'll talk about
Yeah.
something, but yeah, Delhi, it adds value because there are so many monuments and
Hmm.
so much places with history. ये खाने again same to subcontinent. खाने की जगह 200 साल पुरानी है.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
monument is like 1,000 year old, but I think that's common to everybody, every place, especially in subcontinent, and maybe to a greater extent to Europe as well. I think
Mm-hmm.
America is the only region probably that culture does not exist. So I
Yeah.
think Goto, I think that's always been there. Yeah, the only thing is how much you're really exposed to. During our time, this was because there was nothing else. There was
Yeah.
no other means of modes of communication or entertainment, for not communication but modes of entertainment, right? We used to be out a lot,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So when you're out a lot and you're playing a lot outside, and you just sit somewhere, so somebody will start a story. As a kid, somebody will hear something, they'll start a story. And this is a story. This is something, I don't think it's there in the book, but the actual start of this entire journey happened when I grew up in a place called Sarojini Nagar, which
Mm.
is essentially it's mid-layer government officers flats, right? And they're very, very like closely connected flats, right? So it's like for example, one square, what we call it, is has about 20 houses, 10 on this side, 10 on this side, right?
Mm.
Sorry, 40, maybe like 10 ground floor, 10 first floor, and the same on the other side. And there's a large square or a ground in between. So there are houses on either side, and there's a playing ground in the middle. It's could be a
Mm.
playing ground. So then you have people living in very close connection to each other, and there's a common area where everybody conglomerates every day, right? To play, to talk, and stuff like that. So it's a very close community, like, group. So what used to happen was, in the summers back in the early '90s, the coolers I was just started coming, ACs were non-existent, and Delhi summers you can't really, and these are like one-bedroom flats, and
Yeah.
everybody has an average of 6 to 7 people.
Yeah.
So in summers you can't really sleep outside. So we had this culture of, in summers, the half a family used to sleep outside, half a family used to sleep inside the house. And the families, obviously, who used to sleep outside were the kids and the grandparents. Parents obviously slept, inside for obvious reasons.
Hmm.
So you have the grandparents and the kids who were sleeping outside. And so we used to put our charpais once the last of the Doordarshan, which is like national PTV
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
India, that time, whatever the last program used to end, people used to put the charpais outside, hook up the table fans to the latest electricity poles, get a bottle of water. And there was a very unique way of keeping this bottle of water cold. You should, wrap around a cold sack cloth around the bottle
Acha.
to
Acha.
keep it cold the entire night. So these are unique
Right.
quirks we
Right.
used to
Right.
have. So about 10 or 9 o'clock at night, everybody used to start setting the stage for sleeping. And that time, because it was such a close community, it was very safe. So kids used to play. We used to play outside for 10, 11, 12, whatever, during the summer holidays. And then when you're tired, you used to go back
Hmm.
and start sitting around elders who already would have been doing their own kind of discussions about politics or cricket or whatever. But when kids came in, somebody would start a story.
Hmm.
Now, typically, these stories would be stories of partition. People
Hmm.
who have lost everything and started everything. It will be stories of partition. And these partition stories would then lead into, this eatery started, this person came from,
Yeah.
lost everything,
Yeah.
restarted. He
Yeah.
brought this particular delicacy with him, and so. So there'll be about an eating place, or how Delhi used to be when they
Hmm.
first moved here. Right, it was not this. There were not so many buildings. It was largely a jungle, or of a monument that you see, etc. So it was like all kind of stories, largely about Delhi, and then but these stories would always end with somebody pitching in a ghost story, which used to be, again,
Hmm.
it was a story, but again, it covered a lot of things about Delhi. It was not purely a ghost story. It was, again, the way it was told, the way I try telling them in my stories. So that's where I started collecting these stories
Yeah.
subconsciously.
Yeah.
Subconsciously, that's where, because for me, it was not just a ghost story. It was also told me a lot of things about the people, about the places, about Delhi. So that's where it actually started when I was a kid. So then when I moved, I stayed in this area for like 20. I was born there. I lived there for 20 years, and after that, I moved into like sort of more posh upscale colony, which didn't have this kind of community living.
Right.
So I
Right.
started missing these stories. So that's when I started walking and just talking to random strangers and collecting these stories. And then over the years, I realized that while you know when you're listening to these stories, you can, if you put a little bit of your own twist to it,
Of course.
they can become more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's how really the entire journey started.
Now that you're doing all of this, now I'm thinking about if this is possible today, because kids don't play outside anymore like we used to when we were young.
Yeah.
But there are still people growing up in Delhi. They still have some, modern version of this. Though now, because of these tweets, how long have you been out of India?
Out of India, it's been almost 8 years.
8 years. Okay. Do you go back to Delhi
Yeah.
often?
Yeah, yeah. I
Acha.
go back like every year.
So I'm assuming because of, and we'll get to what the release of the situation is around the book as well. But after this, you must have interacted with many new people, right? I'm sure
Yeah,
many of them would have been young as well. People your age, people our age, they probably understand the Delhi you're talking about. People older
yeah.
definitely do. Were the people who are younger than us, much younger, like in their early 20s or even younger, are they able to relate to that Delhi जहाँ आप जा रहे थे बातें कर रहे थे, or is it like a mystical thing for them?
No, so I'll take an example of like sort of, I think my nieces. So
Yeah.
my one niece is like 21-year old.
Okay.
The other niece is like, I think she's 14, right?
Hmm.
So, no, so I don't think for them, that, yeah, a lot of the places are still, so they're testimony to two facts. One, I don't think Delhi has changed a lot fundamentally,
Right.
because the places are still the same. Some of the cultural nuances are still the same. So they relate to that,
Hmm.
but they do not necessarily relate to, or I would say they're not even probably exposed to a lot of these facts about Delhi, and also um, s- some of the how should I put it? Some of the so I'll give it. I think the better way of putting this is actually give an example, right? So there's a book, there's a story which is Old Delhi to Anywhere,
Hmm.
which actually showcase. This is a guy who like goes out every night again collecting stories, and during one of these journeys he came across this whole people sleeping on the footpath and stuff like that. Now, for most of us, that's a very simple thing, right? People who are homeless, they just are immigrants who are coming
Yeah.
in from
Yeah.
small towns. They just sleep, wherever they find a place. Um, but actually, it's actually an alternate sleep economy.
Hmm.
These footpaths are actually manned or
Hmm.
owned by some of the sleep mafia. So you actually have to pay them 20 rupees to get
A spot.
bedding, a
Hmm.
spot, or
Hmm.
and these guys also save the spot for you, and they also sort of take care of your belongings and stuff, right? So it's actually a sleep mafia. You have to sleep, to pay money. So I don't think these kids were so protected. Yeah, they understand that people are there begging and all, but I don't
Yeah.
think they know that this,
Yeah.
or they've spent enough time understanding the actual reason and the mechanisms behind it, right? And
Yeah.
I don't think they really, I think it's again it's element of age. I think probably people who are closer to, after say 25 or 28 years of age, they appreciate the nuances of Delhi, and to learn more about it. Oh, I didn't know this happened in Delhi, or
Hmm.
this used to happen back then, right? So I think nostalgic elements come into the picture as you get a little older. You don't really care about nostalgia when you've not seen it, because that's not nostalgia for you, right? That's history for you.
Right. Right. Right.
It's only people who are closer to 30 who have, either were there just at the cusp where things were changing, and so they could relate and then have a slight bit of nostalgia. Those people,
Huh.
I think, enjoy the book much more.
And also, I feel like you said, now when you moved from that government housing area to like nicer residences, this is sort of
Yeah,
like a negative consequence of upward financial mobility. जैसे हमारे बचपन में नहीं नानी नाना की स्टोरीज हैं, बसों में लटक के जा रहे हैं, ये कर रहे हैं, वो कर रहे हैं.
exactly.
Kids our age, बस में तो हम नहीं जाते bro, हम तो गाड़ी में जाते हैं. And you,
Ah,
which is sure, it's safer, more convenient, whatever, but then you lose that connection to the streets where all these
can I give you a
stories
question?
come
Is
from.
like this particular story I was talking about. This is, so like, kids these days, I don't think anybody, again, upperly mobile at least,
Yeah.
right? They don't travel in what we used to call DTC buses, or the government buses of Delhi. All of us who have traveled have a story about it, like a horror
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Everybody is, they were like horrible buses.
Yeah.
So we all have those horror stories about it. But kids,
Yeah.
especially the upwardly mobile
Yeah.
kids, right? They don't really travel in my nieces have never
Yeah.
stepped inside a bus. So they don't
Yeah.
really relate to it, because these buses have this unique things, because they used to, when they were like out of service board used to be put on them, and they used to use splash. So I was, as a kid, I was very interested. I was like, ये बसें जाती कहाँ हैं? So that's why
Yeah.
I put that
Yeah.
in my
Yeah.
story. This out of service bus, which is like running at 12 o'clock at night, with nobody in the bus. Where
Yeah.
exactly is this bus going?
Yeah.
So I built a story around it. But then somebody who's never been in that bus, probably won't able
They won't even think about it. Huh.
to relate to it.
So getting back to then the genesis of the book. So around fall 2020, you're contacted कि भाई contract है, book करनी है. ठीक है. How long does it take to get all the stories together? What is that process like? Because again, Twitter पे you think of a story, थोड़ा सा formulate किया, डाल दिया. It's out, right? In this, it's like over a year before there's even a product, right? So what was
Correct.
that experience like for you who is writing a book for the first time?
Yeah. So like I said, it's writing a book is a very consuming affair, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really consumes you. Not so, so for me it was still a little easy, because I was still sticking to, my I had an easier role, which is like I'm writing about things. Writing is not as romantic as people, it's not about like sitting in a MacBook in a cafe with a cup of coffee and just generally
हाँ
daydreaming and writing, right? That's
हाँ
that's that's what my perception was writing was.
yeah
कि चलो यार मतलब तो writer बन गए हैं, now we are like I have the license to be pretentious and shit, and writing is not that. It's actually very very consuming,
mm,
because the it's actually a lot of discipline. Every day you wake up and you force yourself. First few days, yeah, you're happy you got a book contract, so you write it, but right, every after that thing wears off, where your initial novelty of, oh, now you've got a book contract, that started wearing off, you realize it's actually very soul consuming, waking up every day and writing and x number of words, and keeping yourself motivated, because someday you'll write well, someday you won't write well. um so it was difficult, right? But then we set ourselves, every day I will write. I used to wake up and say, come rain or shine, if I'm motivated, demotivated, whatever the
right
work is, I will sit on my laptop and will write X number of words, right? And I will leave it at a spot where I'm not fully like spent out, but I know exactly if I start writing tomorrow, what will I write?
mm.
So that's how I used to sort of stop at a point. So I used to write somewhere about 1,000 to 1,500 words a day, but I didn't give it all in every day. I used to stop it at a point where I know exactly where I will pick it up
Mm,
tomorrow and what I will write tomorrow.
mm,
So I know, I have a flow going. So that's how I used to write. And then once I did my part, which is I wrote my story, then I gave it to my wife,
mm.
and she obviously had a more difficult job of doing this, but then she's also a writer by profession, an
Right,
editor by
right, right,
profession.
right,
So for her, and that's also a difference between, I don't know, I've seen between men and women in general, right?
right.
And men typically needs a certain environment. We have this thing, oh, we need 1 hour dedicatedly of deep work and all that shit to do something. If I don't get, I need to
Yeah,
close my door, no disturbance, do
yeah,
something.
yeah.
Women are very adept at multitasking. So my
Right.
wife will, in 30 minutes between doing her office work and taking care of my kid and stuff like that, she'll find that 30 minutes somehow between doing 10 different things and her will do her
Yeah.
writing. Whereas I was like, I used to like wake up in the 4 o'clock, because I was like, I don't need any disturbance. I need to have a
Right,
dedicated
right,
time to
right.
write this stuff. Where
Yeah.
my wife used to, she used to like do 30 minutes to find a slot of 30 minutes between all that stuff she's doing, and she'll write a book. So I think that's, so she did, and of course, so she did then that share of writing. And then obviously, there's a lot of creative, issues. She's, obviously,
How did you guys
she
agree on stuff, or were there disagreements? How was that?
so like, see, I think she didn't care about the plot. When I say care, she's like,
Right,
plot's yours, right?
right, right.
But and I, for me, the plot is the king. The style of writing,
Yeah.
um, the grammar, the style of writing, everything else comes secondary. Your plot has to be strong, and that's how I read as well. I really don't care about, when people say the style of writing. I think if the story is, the plot of the story is intriguing, I read anything.
Mm.
I would not, and that's how I prefer writing. Also, the plot has is the king. But for me, for my wife, it's the style of writing. It's the how the character develops through the story, the character arc, right, as they call it. So those kind of things were important. So I left those to her. She left
Mm.
plot to me. So the only disagreement between me and my wife was essentially because she's also an editor.
Mm.
She'll pick up like, she'll want to make sure that every small thing is right, even the
Yeah.
facts. So for example,
Yeah.
if I'm writing that, for example, somebody is walking from an X place to Y place, and that's about a 5 mile walk. My wife will actually go into Google and check if it's a 5 mile walk or it's a 6 mile walk. I was like, how does
Right.
it matter? She's like, but we're writing about Delhi,
Yeah.
right? People
It's a
is
real
telling
place.
this things about, it's a real
Yeah.
place. So, you
Yeah.
have to check about that. So,
Yeah.
so those, and she's like very particular about, and because she's an editor, for I being a very corporate guy, it's about, perfection, speed over perfection. If the 80% product is ready, just ship it out, right? I mean, don't waste your time perfecting that 20%. My wife has a
Yeah.
different mindset. She's like, it has to be like 100% perfect. Even
Yeah.
now, there were like certain errors that creeped in, which is okay. We're first, I think. But she'll write and then she'll rewrite and then she'll rewrite and then she'll edit and then re-edit and she'll re-edit. And I was like,
Right. Right.
you know,
Right. Right.
I lose my focus after a while. I was like,
Right.
I can't spend that much on one story. I'll move to the other story. But
Ah.
other than that, there was not no major disagreements, other than the fact that let's just move forward.
Ah. Say. So then the book comes out. Um, what is the response like? Acha, and this time I think you had toned down your tweeting stories as much because the book was being put together,
Because
I
the book,
feel.
so I think, so I think what happened was, after a while, I realized that, earlier there was no pressure
Hmm.
to tweet anything. It'll do well, doesn't do well, who cares?
No.
Right? I mean, but once you build a reputation, then you sort of become a little bit more, more more critical of your work.
Yeah.
If this,
Yeah.
even if it's a tweet,
Yeah.
it doesn't really
Yeah.
matter. Even if it's a tweet, just become a little more critical. So a little bit more, is this worth tweeting?
Yeah.
Earlier, I didn't care. It's a tweet, yeah. Who cares? I mean, okay, people will like it. Some
Yeah.
people will not like it. That's fine. Now I've become a little more critical,
Because you know that there's a
and
much bigger
because I
audience.
know because there's a much bigger audience.
Yeah.
So I, you know, obviously, the one is, of course, between work and a book and a podcast, you don't get that much time. But even if I do, I'll be like, is this only if I think it's really good,
Hmm.
then I'll tweet it. I think the other thing also happened is a lot of these tweets got stolen, and people started featuring them in their podcasts. And then
Right. Right.
I'm going to do my own podcast, I really don't want to people saying that oh, we heard it
Ah.
somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like I've been a little more you know
सही है.
कि थोड़ा देख के I don't
हाँ.
tweet that much now, but
Yeah.
otherwise, but
क्योंकि
actually my
इंटरनेट पे.
best work.
हाँ.
Internally, there's nothing, but actually, the best work, these 10 stories, I don't think these are on best work by
Right.
from the horror perspective.
Right.
From the Delhi perspective, yes, I think I've put all the best stuff that I knew about Delhi in these stories, right? I still can pull up a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, from Delhi perspective, I think this is some good work I've put in. From the horror perspective, I don't think this is my best work in terms of, because these are the initial stories, just first 10 stories, right? I, I have much more, stories from the better plot I've written after this,
Right. Right.
which is actually from the plot perspective, from the actual storyline perspective. There were stories that I wrote after this are or tweeted after this are actually, or in the podcast even, are
Hmm.
actually much better than the ones
हाँ.
in the book. Because there was
But
very initial work.
चलो, we'll definitely come to what is happening in the future. But चलें, ठीक है, आपकी book comes out, ठीक है.
Ah,
After a big period of gestation, अच्छा book आ जाती है. What was the book release experience like? उस वक्त का response कैसा था? Now that there's a physical product that you're attached to, what was that like?
see, I think it was a very humbling experience, and it it sort of exposed me to
Hmm.
the kindness of people.
Hmm.
I'm not a name, or I'm not we, but me and my wife, we are not a name in a literary circle, right? It's not like people know us.
Yeah.
But it was just people from the point it was pre-ordered. The day I said it was pre-ordered, people are like pre-ordering the book and letting me know they have pre-ordered and stuff. And it was entire Twitter, right? So I think 26th December, I think book was released. I tweeted a week before that or 2 weeks before that stuff for pre-ordering, and there are so many people who just pre-ordered, and it was just we were like every day for like at
Hmm.
least 2 months. I think 1.5 months. And every day I was getting 10 people who were saying we have ordered the book, not just reviews, but we have just because I wrote it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they've just pre-ordered the book or ordered the book. You, for example, it's not available in anywhere in outside of India, but you still managed to get a hard
Yeah.
copy from somewhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just the kindness. I was overwhelmed, to be very honest, with just pure kindness of the people where says, here's a guy,
Yeah.
we know him, and to be very honest, in today's day and age, I don't have like, friends in moved here like 10 years ago. I live in a very suburban US. I nowhere I remotely close friends that I used to have in Delhi. Most of, and even if you do, the friendships that you forge in your 30, in your mid 30s
Yeah,
and late 30s is very different from, you can't choose in your friends basis, interest, right? You make friends, and then if you have a
yeah,
common interest, great. If you don't, you have dinners together, you do some stuff, and you go back home, right?
yeah, yeah,
Twitter is actually a place where I connect with people basis, either my love for Delhi
yeah.
or for whatever reason. I think not just, but at least. So Twitter to me has been a place which has given me a great comfort in forging these friendships and these relationships with like-minded people like yourself and
Sure.
others from across the world, right? And these people would just been so kind just because they know me, just because, there's a guy called Jatin and we know him for like 10 years or whatever, and we're on time and he's written a book and we have to promote it. There are people who have, I'm pretty sure, who just bought the book even though they have never read horror in their life, or they would not want to read horror novel just because they want to encourage me, add to
Right,
my numbers, and they
right.
would have ordered that book or gifted that book. The book is actually was number one for a very long time. I think it still is number one most gifted book in travel on
Wow,
Amazon.
wow.
So we are gifting these books, right? It was very, to be honest, more than the process of writing the book or selling the book. I really don't, and obviously it's not like a huge bestseller that is just running off the shelves, right?
Sure,
Horror, any which ways, has a very limited,
sure, sure.
audience. Whatever it sold, also I think it sold more because of Delhi angle.
Mm.
It did better in travel than in horror, right? So
Mm.
I think it's like, but people, it's just a very humbling experience to see, how people would who have never met me in real life and just know me on Twitter would absolutely just go and buy books just because I've written it. It's
Yeah,
almost like a family, people just like
yeah.
किसी ने किया तो वही हमें तो ले पढ़े चाहे ना पढ़े
Ah,
but
ah.
we'll buy. And interestingly, nobody, hardly one or two people actually came and told me that, send us a free book or something of that sort. Everybody's like,
Right, right.
even if I offer to somebody, they're like, no, no, we'll buy it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I understand that sentiment because I've seen it happening. This is, I mean, social media gets a bad rap for
Yeah,
many things, and there's valid. मगर इस तरह के experiences भी आते हैं. Like, the friends of mine that you met in the previous podcast was Rizwan Sakhel. I met them through Twitter. ये वो तो it
right.
is really possible in the ideal circumstances to not have those distances be an issue in forging those actual friendships like you're mentioning. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so the book comes out, it's doing well, response is great, सब कुछ ठीक है. The podcast. I have yet to come to your podcast in terms of my
Yeah.
own listening. But what was the idea? How early did you have the idea कि ये भी होना है? And what's the concept behind that?
So the podcast journey was a little slow, right? So I think
Sure.
the day I started tweeting, the day it started famous, everybody told me start a podcast or
Right.
as a YouTube, right?
Right.
And I did some work, but I was not convinced that,
Hmm.
I didn't wanted to do a podcast which was, I'm me just going in and telling the stories.
Right.
Might have worked, but if I I always wanted to make sure that if I ever do a podcast, it has to be very sleek, very well produced, right? And of very high international quality. Because I have heard Indian podcasts, and to be very honest, I don't want to sort of say that mine is better or anything, but Indian
Yeah.
horror podcast, even the one they're doing extremely well on Spotify and have been
Yeah.
running for
Yeah.
many years and are like much above our podcast, I don't find them impressive at all. And
Right.
I'll tell you very straight, books, yes, they'll be like, there are many authors, many books that are better than our book. I'll say it one.
Sure.
But on podcast, I don't think, it's very cliched, very, I just don't enjoy Indian podcast. So I don't want to create anything of that level. I want to make very sure that it has to be a very, very well produced, extremely professional podcast, right? So, and I was not finding a lot of people approached me, and the other part was, a lot of people who approached me sort of said, "अच्छा, आप ऐसा करो, आप स्टोरी लिख दो या रिकॉर्ड कर दो और हम लेके जाएंगे स्पॉटिफाई या किसी के पास Chala to theek hai, wala, it's fine. I was like, what, then what are value that you are bringing, right? If
Yeah.
it's my story, I am doing it. I can
You
go to
can,
Spotify myself,
yeah, yeah.
also. No? I can say, so what are you doing, right?
Yeah.
What's the value that you're bringing? Like,
Yeah.
don't come up with to me. And a lot of people came with it. It's like, you write it, you narrate it,
Yeah.
and we'll take it to these platforms and we'll see. I
Ha,
was like,
ha.
that, I don't want to, do that, right?
Yeah.
Then Roshan Abbas, who's a very well-known
Yeah.
media personality, TV personality, so he obviously follows me on Twitter, and he says, "Have you thought about making stories out of making a podcast out of it?" Now, Roshan Abbas, I was the kind of person. Earlier, I also thought it'll probably go the same way, like a Bollywood stories way, but it didn't. Luckily, it did. So, Roshan put a very, a specialist in each area. So like I have my stories, but they got
Mm.
a writer to actually write it for a podcast, right?
Right.
So I just
Right.
give my tweets, they write it for a podcast. They got a very, Anuj, who is my voice in the podcast. He's a award-winning voice actor. So it is his voice. Similarly, the Ikrup, who was the producer, and Shantanu, who was the producer, again, they do this for a living. The whole mixing part, the voice part, the sound part, again, was done by a very professional studio. Yes, it was a long process because of various reasons. Like at one point of time, I always thought it's not going to happen.
Right.
But when it did happen, it actually was a very professional. It's called Bhoot Bhulaiya.
Yeah.
Season one is about
Yeah.
10 episodes.
Huh. I'll add it to the description also
It's
for listeners
Yeah,
and viewers. Yeah.
and it was and still is always on Apple. On fiction podcasts, it's between number one and number two. The difference between the book and the podcast is book we have kept horror at a very sort of not very gory. The
Right.
focus was,
Right.
even if the folks who are not really horror, who don't read horror, should be able to read it because of Delhi.
Right.
And you can see in the sales, it's selling more in travel than actually
Right.
selling in fiction. Right?
Ah.
It's selling more, and that for me is a win, because that's how I intended to write it. I didn't intend it to be a very out and out horror book. The podcast, on the other hand, is out and out horror podcast. So some of the most
Right.
scary stories that I've picked up, and we put them in the podcast.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
So
Mm.
you want it's not so much about Delhi or things like that. It's a very out and out horror
हाँ हाँ
podcast.
जैसे in the haunting of Delhi city I think the important bit is Delhi city in the book
Correct,
title
correct.
हाँ
Yep.
but so how has the response been to the podcast because again now
I
you
think
have
podcast.
somebody who's looking at your stories
Yeah, yeah.
sort of changing them
So
a bit
podcast is one, like I said, it's been very good. It's been in fiction, even it's just for a season. And podcast, you've been in podcast world for a lot longer than I have, and what I've heard, it takes, it's a very long drawn game.
yeah
It's not a short arc.
yeah
It's a very long arc to really get your name out there, and
yeah yeah
make it to the point where it's commercially viable, not even commercially viable, where people are listening to it regularly.
yeah
But we have been sort of, I think, so from that angle, if I see about it, yeah, I think we are just about 5 episodes right now, and within like third episode, it was in Apple's number one and number two top
हाँ
fiction
हाँ हाँ
charts. Spotify, it lagged, it came up to 60, 65, but
sure
Apple and a couple of others, it's been in like number one or number two within like second to third episode of its release.
mm-hmm. So
We
how
also,
does
I think
huh
in Bombay, they did a very, I think, very unique thing, which was a very immersive experience where they actually played the podcast in a movie screening theater, but
right
just with the sound.
right
It's like in a very dark area, but with those immersive sound experience when they first
right
launched it. So I think that was a very unique thing they did with the podcast. So stuff like that, it helps.
does so now that you have a book ठीक है पहले तो you just had notes in a diary and सुने सुनाए oral history type कहानियाँ then came the tweets ठीक है so that's one medium that your all of this came out in now there's a book now there's a podcast the thing is as you change mediums even for the same story that story takes on some sort of new elements once it's been put in that medium and does that give you new ideas for the future
Yeah,
because
see, everything
हाँ
absolutely it does, because I'm sorry, but
because पहले तो ये था ना कि किसी ने कहानी सुना दी जतिन भाई ने लिख दी, जतिन भाई ने किसी और को भी बता दिया. Now there's like an audio immersive experience where other people are bringing their expertise and inspirations in, and that's giving the story perhaps more dimension than even you could have initially imagined, because that thing didn't exist at the time, right? But I'm sure that now you must have या तो एक किताब लिख दी या एक और किताब लिख दी, but now that there's a podcast, now there's all of this extra stuff that has happened. Is that just expanding your horizons of what is possible in the
It
future?
does. Even the same story, if you sit and write it on a different day,
Huh,
you write
huh.
it in a very different way, right? So it all or somebody else adds it. A lot of time, I end a story, saying Twitter, right? I'll write a story and I'll end it, and I thought that's the end of the story. But somebody would DM me and say and add another tweet to it, which actually makes the story very interesting. So more you
Right.
collaborate, obviously, the more you collaborate. Like in the podcast, I collaborate with the writer Deepthi.
Hmm.
So obviously, they'll or with the producer of the podcast, they'll bring in their perspective. So, or more you collaborate, the better things. Or not everything gets better. Sometimes it's like the original is better, but
Sure.
obviously, more people collaborate, the more things better. Even from your perspective, right? Once you've tweeted a story, and then you go back after a certain period and start to rewrite that story from a podcast perspective or a
Yeah.
book perspective, you
Yeah.
realize that there are other things now, because that you have the luxury of not boxing it within a few characters. There are other things that you can add to make it more interesting. So that always happens. Even same story every time I sit and rewrite it. There's certain elements that you add or delete to make it better or to make it more suitable for the medium that you're writing it for.
Hmm. Has Bollywood come back now that there's
They keep coming
streaming
back.
products?
Bollywood
Acha.
keeps coming back. I'm telling you, every I will have somebody or the other keep coming back. That's been it's been it's been that experience where every time and interestingly, Bollywood doesn't come from books or from podcasts. They come from tweets.
Acha.
So last time, a very prominent, like tier one director came to me. One of the stories went viral a few months back, um, and he came to me and he's like, I was in a gym and my gym trainer showed me the story. And I was like, I don't know who you are or you are a professional writer or not, but you sure know how to write a story. So let's work together. So he's like, convert this tweet into a small story for me. So we did that. He's like, yeah, we'll get the writers and stuff like that. And then nothing really came about it. So I realized that, it happened when it happened, or if it
Right.
doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. Yeah, but
Huh.
I think maybe it's time for me to sort of get an agent or somebody of that sort, because I think it gets a little bit, with a full-time job and a kid and a family, and then you're writing, marketing your own product and marketing your
Yeah.
own name,
Yeah.
and going out and finding the buyers for it is difficult. I
Yeah.
think, yeah,
Yeah.
and that's a fear that I have right now. I have a book, I have a podcast, I have a certain, this thing. Tweet was one thing. Obviously, you have a certain following on Twitter, but you have a book or a podcast which have done relatively well. Both of them, not like a blockbuster, but for a big
Sure.
somebody who's
Sure.
never done this before, I think it's done well. And I have my own set of folks who like the way I write. So, I don't want it to get to a point where it's like they become stale and I have not capitalized on it
Yeah.
because I didn't had the right people
Yeah.
doing,
Yeah.
you know, working for on it. So maybe
Huh.
it's, I've been thinking maybe it's time to, get an agent both from the book perspective, from more work perspective, and look at those things. So let's see.
Yeah, I was thinking, what you would know more about this. Bollywood to chalo is this one huge machine, but India mein, Netflix and Amazon and all these people and also local services are also making a ton of content. Unka relationship thoda scene
I think
fark
it's
hai?
this. I think I don't know really all the details of it because at the end of the day, it is the same Bollywood people who are actually
Oh,
making it,
right.
right?
Of course, of
So,
course. Huh.
so it's the same thing. It's not like a Netflix would make something directly, right?
Hmm.
Or if I go to a Netflix, I don't even know how to pitch to a Netflix. But these
Right.
are the same people. I've been speaking to them for a while now. There's something called they call I think Bible or something they call it, which they prepare and then they pitch it to all
Acha.
these Netflix and all this. So it's the
Right.
same set of people. Like the makers are the same, right? It's just the production houses. they will then select. So people like you and me can't go to production house directly, right? I mean, it's
Right,
the
right,
same
right.
people who will go to them.
No, and that is also, the content creator dilemma where you might have like a full-time day job, but you're also making the stuff and you're doing your marketing and your promotion and sab kuch
Yeah.
life bhi manage karni hai in the background. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think now that you have
So for
managed
I can't
to,
even manage an Insta, right? I mean,
uh,
I don't think I'm a content creator, first of all. I think, and I'll be very honest, right? The
sure,
book would have done probably twice as better
huh,
if I had the same amount of, uh, the same amount of traction on Insta. Because
right,
let's
right,
trust, everything sells on Insta. I'll
yeah,
be very, it's like everything sells
Pakistan mein bhi
on
वैसा ही है.
Insta
Yeah,
or TikTok.
yeah,
Wherever there's a TikTok, India doesn't have TikTok, so it's all Insta. But other
Insta Reels,
countries, it's everything
sure,
sells.
huh,
It's a sells on Insta on and TikTok. So it's very, and I am like, I've tried it. I can't relate to that medium too much. I've tried to become, because Twitter is it's organic. A thought comes into your mind. You don't have to worry about making it pretty, or
yeah,
you write it. People engage with it. You don't have to
yeah,
like. You don't have to worry about if I get so because you get stories in weirdest of situations. You never get good stories when you're actually sitting and writing it. You always get good stories or good ideas when your mind is doing something else or you're
yeah,
doing
yeah,
something
yeah,
else. And it's a subconscious mind that always creates the best work. And that's not,
hmm,
I think that's true for all of us, right? These ideas,
hmm.
when we actually focusing on a very narrowly focused, I have to create something, I have to write something, I have to good a story, you'll probably not be able to do it. But when your mind is free, that's when, and the moment you get an idea, you tweet it. You just frame it and you write it.
Yeah,
It takes me like, you know, it take once I get an idea, to be very
huh,
honest, it takes me and maybe about 20 minutes to create that idea into a plot end to end, and another 15 minutes to write it. So I've never
sure,
spent more than 30 to 35 minutes on a Twitter story, and
huh,
it'll done. And then you
huh,
immediately starts getting reactions to it, good, bad, ugly, whatever it is. So you have good instant feedback. So it's a very organic way. Insta pay, thinking about, is this going to flow, is this looking pretty, is
yeah,
this, and
yeah,
I've never been engaged with such. So that's where I also struggle, because I think it's very important for everybody, if you're thinking about doing anything that sells, to have a certain traction on Insta, and I've
yeah.
struggled with it.
Because that's the new
So
marketplace, right? Like even if you're buying things in the real world, advertising to सारी उधर हो रही है. That's
absolutely.
the classified section जो होता था एक ज़माने में.
Yeah.
So then you've mentioned now the podcast is different to the book that's out in terms of vibe, in terms of intensity. Stories bhi fark hain. And you've mentioned that this first book, I mean, you've said it's, these stories are more Delhi than horror, and there are a whole bunch of stories. So what is there much about the future, about current work in progress that you can talk about, or just say that something's coming?
So you see, I have, I've realized that, you know like I said, writing is a discipline. It's a
Hmm.
muscle that you have to keep working on. So I've been trying to get in the discipline of writing a story every day, right? So if I like a story on Twitter that I've
Hmm.
written, I
Hmm.
will sit and then start expanding into a story, right? 1,500 words, 100 words, whatever it is. I'm still not reached a stage where I'm doing it regularly, because once you get the contract, you have a deadline
Right,
which
right.
says, you have to meet the deadline, right?
Yeah,
But once you
yeah,
don't have a deadline,
yeah.
you so so one, I think there's few things, right? So now that I have a first book which is done relatively well, I know what went good, I went bad. The second book that I want to write, I don't want to focus on the quantity, that to keep producing a book 3 months. The number of stories I have, I can easily write three more books on the same lines. Will it be the bigger success from this one? I don't know.
Hmm.
What I'm trying to focus on is, and I've been reading a lot, the things I've been doing well, not doing well, etc. What I'm trying to focus is create, take the time, but create something that is much bigger, that creates a much bigger boom or an impact than the last book.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to, and and these heads, the other big problem with bigger ideas is that you're always just thinking about them. कि
Mhm.
कुछ बड़ा बनाएंगे, कुछ बड़ा
हाँ,
करेंगे, छोटे
हाँ,
होते कुछ नहीं होता, कुछ बड़ा करेंगे. But that's also another, the ideal situation is small things come out much quickly,
yeah,
easier to
yeah,
produce,
yeah,
right? And so this is like, I'm not comparing myself to Chetan Bhagat, but Chetan Bhagat novel is like what, 200 words, right? And but this did well. I mean, whatever people's opinion about him is doesn't
yeah,
really
yeah,
matter. Then
yeah,
he's a very successful author. You can hate his way of writing. It doesn't
yeah,
make a difference
sure.
to him or to else because he's
Ah,
he's sold. Right?
yeah,
He really created that market for himself, and he came out with a book every 3-4 months, right? And small books, right? That did well. On the other hand, I don't know whether you have read this book called Age of Vice.
nahi,
It just
हाँ,
came out. If you haven't, you should. It's been doing really well internationally. One of the few Indian books, Indian authors, and it's about it's a crime thriller,
okay,
right?
okay,
And it's been doing really well internationally. One of the few Indian authors who has done so well. It got sold to HBO or somebody even before it was released, right? So other thing there are these people who takes 2 or 3 years to write a book, but then the moment it's released, it's actually creates an impact on books as auction and stuff like that, right?
right, right,
So so that's what I've been like sort of thinking as to see. I think one thing I know is that short stories is my forte. I don't know whether I can write a novel. First of all, I don't really enjoy reading horror novels.
hmm,
It takes very few people like Stephen King or some of those people to create a horror in a novel, in an actual
yeah,
book, to
yeah,
create the element of horror, keep going, going,
yeah,
going.
yeah, yeah,
Most of the books that I've read, it get boring. I mean, how much horror you can,
हाँ, हाँ,
visual in a book in words you can describe for a like 400-page, 500-page novel. So I don't think I'll write a horror novel. I think I'll keep writing, yeah, stories. But the point is, I want these stories, maybe 3 or 4 stories, no, maybe not 10, maybe a little more, impactful stories, bigger
right,
stories.
right, right,
But do something that actually, creates more buzz than the previous book, maybe on a
hmm,
larger scale.
hmm,
So that's something. So I right now that's one part I'm working on, right? Which is again
right,
maybe a collection of 4 to 5 stories, not 9, but a little bit more. And horror is not a very doesn't do very well in Indian market, right? But internationally, it's again one of the bestsellers.
sure,
So can I get a? And my book is unique because it gives you a glimpse of a city in Delhi. So it's everything that probably would, it's a travel plus.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
get an international release maybe. I don't know. So that's one part of it. Um, Second is what I'm on this side. What I'm really thinking about is to write a thriller, not horror,
okay,
but because I've also started experimenting now with the stories. I don't
right,
write just
right, right,
just
right,
horror. I also write murder mysteries and stuff like in short
हाँ,
format, same format but thrillers, right? Murders and stuff like that. So I'm trying to figure out if I can write because that's what I really enjoy reading. I don't enjoy reading horror a lot, to be
hmm,
very honest.
hmm,
I
hmm,
don't
hmm,
like I said, it's the very few authors who I think short stories, yes. A lot of good authors write very good short stories, but novels, it's not. But murder mysteries and thrillers is what I really enjoy reading, and I want to make. And I in my lifetime, I would want to write at least one good, really good murder mystery or a thriller or a crime thriller kind of a book. So those are
hmm,
the one horror stories are there. It's just a matter of should I repeat the same in the second book, which I
yeah,
can do it very quickly, to be very honest,
yeah,
or change the format a little bit and write it that way. So that's happening on the side, and we'll get there. The second is um, write the same. So one which is very close to my heart right now, which I'm thinking about right now, is writing a book of short stories, which is not just horror,
hmm,
but it is the entire genre in one, which is crime, murder, thriller, and horror.
hmm,
But
hmm,
again, so
hmm,
the
hmm,
entire gamut in one book, but based on Delhi.
hmm, hmm,
Murder happening, there's horror happening, there's crime happening. So then you are expanding,
yeah,
a little bit because
yeah.
horror just box it, and there's I know it's a very limited audience of horror in
Hmm,
India.
hmm, hmm. I was wondering if, when reading these cities stories, because they're all happening in one city, there is also the potential for the stories to be connected to each other, like not in a
Yeah, so that's
direct way,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
But like if
yeah.
it's
So
like
that's
a
correct.
police wala hai, so this one police wala is in,
Correct,
encountering
correct.
these different
No, it is,
situations.
yes. So
Yeah.
I don't know, there's a book called New York Trilogy,
Okay.
which is again on the same lines, which
Okay.
is like they're three stories, but they're interconnected, right? Or there was a movie called LSD,
Hmm.
Love, Sex, and Dhoka, which was
Acha.
again,
Yes.
it was very interesting. It was again three, I think three short stories, seemingly absolutely
Yeah.
unrelated,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but then there's a unique twist in the end where all three were actually connected. So I really like that
Right.
format. So
Right.
I'm
Right.
trying to see if, and I've always had that thing in mind where you put in like three stories together which look seemingly unconnected, but then in the
Yeah.
end, it
Yeah.
all comes together.
Ah. Yeah. Oh, that's great. ठीक है, Jatin bhai, thank you very much for your time. Very early in the
Thank you
morning
so
for
much,
you.
sir, for having me. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But yeah,
Real
I'm really
pleasure.
glad to have found you on Twitter. And I'm sure as long as you keep doing stuff, or
We-
even if not, I think we'll be in touch. But thanks again for this.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Really
Thank you
happy
so
for
much
the
for
book.
having me.
I'll get
Thank
into the
you. Thank you
podcast
for buying. I don't
links
know how you
below.
got it, but
Fasting. There is, I think it's some individual who has imported them from India, and they were on Amazon UK.
oh, wow.
Think that's how I got them. But हाँ, जैसे भी है, I'll put the link,
Uh,
all the links I can find in the description, for the viewers, listeners, whatever. And yeah, best of luck for the future. Really happy to see all of
Thank
this.
you so much. I really always happy to chat with you. Work or no
Appreciate it.
work,
हाँ हाँ,
but
बिल्कुल
it's
बिल्कुल
still fun.
बिल्कुल. Okay जी. Thank you guys for listening.
Sir,
We'll see you
thank
next
you.
week whenever. Bye guys.